Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Leadership Toolkit. It's Wednesday afternoon, which means it's time to get into another awesome conversation. As you know, this is your definitive leadership growth podcast. And what I get to do, I have the pleasure each week to connect with awesome people from all over the US, sometimes all over the globe, and have discussions on leadership, entrepreneurship, business, management. How can you grow? How have they won, and what successes have they seen? And then sometimes what are the failures that they have experienced, and how can you overcome it without having to endure it yourself? So this week on the show is no different. I have an absolutely amazing guest, Dr. Carla Fowler, and she is the founder of Thaxa. And what that does, they do executive performance coaching. That grew out of a passion for performance science, where strategy, productivity, and psychology intersect. And so as leaders, like, don't we all want to know that? We want to be able to dissect it on where they intersect so that we have the opportunity to learn and grow more. So I am excited today to introduce Dr. Carla Fowler. Thank you for joining me today.
Hey, Mike. Great
How
to
are
see
you?
you.
Great to see you. Thank you again for making the time. So, as we talked, you are a medical doctor. You got your PhD in beforehand. We mentioned, you said immunology, so you're very popular in the last several years. And so, if you would, Dr. Fowler, if you would take a little bit of time and share what is your background, how do you move from medical doctor into executive coaching? What's your background in leadership and management and entrepreneurship? I'd love if you would sit and share that with us today, Carla.
Yeah, happy to, Mike. Um, well, for the past 12 years, as you pointed out, I founded and have been growing an executive coaching practice, all based around helping leaders who have ambitious goals use performance science as a way to help them improve their results, improve their leadership, go after things that inspire them, that are challenging, that have uncertainty and risk involved. And that has been my most recent chapter. As you pointed out, I came into executive coaching through a really different route than many people. And, it's kind of funny when you realize that a big piece of your, career story is actually it becomes known within the pivot. And so actually that's a question I get asked a lot. And I know I'm not alone in being a person who finds themselves at a crossroads in their career, needing to say, hey, what's next? Or what do I really want? And so those questions definitely were coming up to me about 13 years ago. So I was on basically a training pathway for academic medicine. And what that means is I went into a program where you go get your MD, kind of like typical medical school, except in the middle of it, you take a break,
Quote unquote
and,
break, right? Sure.
and you go get a PhD, often in a biological science, but sometimes people do other interesting things like ethics or history or something like that. But I did it in immunology. And so that took about 5 years in the middle. And then you come back, you finish your medical school, you go generally into a residency program. And I chose general surgery. So I was doing that at Stanford. And, there were a lot of things that I really liked about that pathway. I'm kind of a glutton for punishment, or maybe a different way to say it is, I think from a very early age, I learned that I liked to find ways to gain entrance into a challenging arena.
Okay.
So for example, going to medical school is a great example of this because, again, you are going to be surrounded by all these smart people. It's difficult to get in. And there's no way you get in and out of that arena without learning something, without really pushing yourself to your full potential. And I think as a young person, I sort of figured out that even though I was definitely uncomfortable in those situations, so I'm not immune to the fear or the insecurity that I think many of us feel when we're in that kind of situation, but that I learned after the fact, I would grow so much, I would feel very proud of what I had accomplished, and I would realize that I had accomplished things that I'm not sure I proactively could have just gotten myself to do had I not been in an environment that really pushed that for me. So this was kind of always a piece of my personality. And I think I also always was kind of interested in, well, what does make people really good at things? What makes them top performers? And I can even remember moments as early as like 5th grade that I was like thinking about this question. So that's just a little bit about me, a little bit of the backstory to say I was very much a math and science nerd. I liked people. And so in wanting to impact them in a positive way, the idea of being trained in science and medicine made a ton of sense. And a lot of that actually did kind of bear out for me. So I loved working with people one-on-one. I loved talking with them about decisions, helping them through challenging decision-making or problem solving with regards to their health. I found, the science of it all interesting as well. But sometimes, you're like going along in your career and you're like, okay, yeah, I like this. But then you run into some things that don't really match with you. So for example, when I got into the general surgery residency, everything was going great. It was my first choice. And you really kind of get out there, you're practicing and learning like 80 hours a week. And it was interesting. It was one of the first times when I felt like I lost a lot of my autonomy of time. So when I was in medical school, one of the funny things is that for me, I actually found that I was able to really like control my time. So on the side, I was going to medical school, but I also was like, I really want to play athletics still. Like I loved college sports. I loved high school sports. I was playing ultimate frisbee on an elite club team at the time in Seattle. And I was like, I still have dreams to be a really high level athlete. So on the side, I was like going to practices. We were going to tournaments. We went to like the national tournament and won it a couple of times. So there was this whole like other world that I was also engaging with. And I found that I was able to do that. I mean, you have to be a little bit creative with time and you have to be very brutally focused. But I was able to do that. And I think one of the interesting things about getting out into residency was a realization of like, oh no, 80% of your time is now spoken for. And there was not that same autonomy of time. I think there were also some cultural aspects of it that I realized didn't sort of use all of the strengths I had in terms of working with people, in terms of like thinking about performance, how might you make things better, how you might make some of the team dynamics work better. And so there were just a number of things that I was like, I don't know that I don't know where this goes, but I can sort of see the people who are ahead of me on the pathway. And I'm not sure that's sort of the career life that I want for myself. And of course, this is a very inconvenient thing to realize after 11 years of training.
Well, yeah, what's crazy here as you're going through this path and I'm listening, and the first thing I picked up on, and here's something that I want people to hear, is because it's easy for people on the outside to be looking in and maybe watching a show like this and they go, oh wow, Carla's got it all together. It's funny because you're like, well, I went to medical school and then I took a break to get my PhD, right? A 5-year break, no big deal. And then just went back, right? Well, we're encompassing that in a few minutes of conversation. So from the outside, you have this, speaking of time, you're talking autonomy of time, like you have this significant compression of time because you can sit and articulate that to somebody and say, hey, this is how I did this thing. But I think one of the things that I want people to hear especially is while you're summing it up in a couple of minutes in a few sentences to say this, that's an 11-year dedication. And so when it comes to whatever field somebody's wanting to grow in, whether it be leadership or management or being a medical doctor or being a top end athlete, it takes a tremendous amount of dedication and time. And I think so often people, especially right now, you have YouTube and social media and all this stuff. Somebody looks it up and says, well, I want to know how to do the thing, whatever the thing may be, right? I want to be a better manager. And so I look up a 5-minute video and I watch this person that has 11 years of experience under their belt 11 years of practice, or maybe more than that, 15, 18, 20 years of practice, that they can sum up this thing in 5 minutes. Well, the reason they're able to do it in 5 minutes now is because of all the experience. And so it's interesting you're saying, well, it's something kind of crazy to realize or find that I wanted to pivot and do something different after all of this time. Um, at the same time, you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't dedicated that. Is that fair to say that you wouldn't have realized that had you not been in it and dedicating that and really immersing yourself in that space?
Mike, you brought up at least two really interesting points here, which I love. I think the first one is this idea of like that where does our performance come from, and this idea that there are long arcs often associated with that.
Okay.
And like one of the biggest like misperceptions about performance that I encounter as I'm coaching and working with people is this idea that somehow performance is like a set of tricks and hacks or like secrets that like if we can just find them, and of course now we have much more access on the internet, all the technology we have, this idea that we can go on a search, and if we can just find that thing, or we're looking for the guru who has it, right? And it's what I found is that this is one of the biggest things that can actually distract us from improving our performance, because it puts us on a journey looking for that shortcut, as opposed to saying, we probably already have 5 good ideas about what like we could work on, a good idea we already have that we could start practicing and starting to stack up some hours getting a facility with that idea, and really working on that. And like notably, now kind of coming to the second point, over the practice of medicine, one of the really interesting things that I learned, as you said, like I put in a lot of time, and actually this is true of the science too, I practice skills and tools that I use every day in coaching. I couldn't predict it. I couldn't, like in the middle of medicine, nowhere in my head was I'm going to go into performance coaching, and I can give you some examples.
Yeah, please. That was my next question. Give me some examples. Let's go.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things when I was I was the baby resident, when you're the intern, like Grey's Anatomy style, like you're the baby resident. So like
it's
the
funny.
youngest person,
Let me interject here. When you were talking about it, don't lose this thought, because I want to know the skills and tools. But when you were talking about medicine and you said, I lost my autonomy of time, that was where my head went. Like my wife and I used to religiously watch Grey's Anatomy, and I don't know whether that's a true and good depiction of how the medical profession is. But for us, that was what it was. And I'm like, oh my gosh, these guys don't sleep. They're in it all the time. You get bought in on the characters. It was funny when you were saying that was actually where my head went.
yeah.
Okay, so skills and tools. What are some things that are the crossover? You said, hey, I practiced medicine for all this time. And what are some of the things that you're still using, or that you actively use every day, that you learned during that time frame?
Well, some of the examples are, it is rare that there's a field where you are allowed to, at a relatively early stage of experience, have deep conversations, deep, important decision-making conversations with people about stuff that like really matters, that has high stakes, right?
Sure.
And certainly in coaching, one of the common things that I talk with people, I'm a thought partner for them as they are trying to think through decision making, have a good process for that, try and avoid pitfalls or biases or different things. And so that is something that, it was like, often as a surgical resident, you're often doing pre-op conversations, like helping people with that. You're going in and talking to people. You have many reps of that, maybe 20 reps of that over the course of a day. And just how to be in that space, how to ask questions, how to draw out someone else's priorities, while still being able to educate if there are some facts and or best practices. This is something I find comes up all the time in coaching, because someone you're working with, an executive or a leader, they have values, they have things that are what will make a right decision for them in the context that they are in. But there also are some best practices. And I think part of the art of coaching, I've always found that it was never about like, well, never give advice or never give information. I think it's a balance. You have to both draw out the wisdom of a client because they know themselves, they know their context. But you also, there are good principles that really help people. So sometimes we have to like lay those out too, and then together look at the whole pile of things and say, yeah, what does this tell us about what might be helpful? So that is one skill set that I got a lot of practice with that has been really important in coaching. A second one, let's do a science example, is that science is very different than medicine. So medicine is like, let's say there might be certain fields where there's a lot more structure. There are structured expectations and deliverables. Finance might be an example of this, just in the sense of like, generally you got to close the books every month. There are some clear processes for this. So I would say medical school is a little more like that. Science is like, you have a job because nobody knows the answer and you have to go figure it out. So that's a little more like startup land. And you have to walk in every day and you have to both design the process and decide what's most important to spend your time and resources on to learn something, hopefully something that's valuable to the field. And so one of the things I learned from my mentor, who's pretty hands-off, so I had a lot of autonomy, but it also meant I kind of like, was splashing around a lot, sort of trying to figure it out. And so I walked into his office and one day and was kind of like, oh, I could do this. These are all the experiments I could do. And he was like, Carla, why would you do those experiments? And this was not a rhetorical question. He was like, what's the question you're answering? Like, why is that an important answer? And so he was the person who really taught me that you got to think about what questions are you asking? Why are they important? Why might it be valuable? And this is not dissimilar in leadership when we're trying to think about what we're going to focus on, because often there are a lot of different fires burning. You have to decide like where are you going to pay attention, where are you going to spend resources, either your own or your team's time and attention. And so trying to figure out what are the most important questions to ask, or the most important place to focus your efforts, or the most important goals to go after, very relevant. And so that's often a topic I'm talking with leaders about today.
No, I think that those are phenomenal. And I always try and go back and recap as I sit and take notes to make sure, because you answered it. You said, hey, here's a couple of things. But in your first one, I pulled out 3 things. And then in your second one, maybe one or two. And so I want to recap this because as people are listening, and when you're listening in, and I always encourage people, take notes, right? Take notes for, what is being said, but also that's something I think that's important in leadership. And one of the reasons I recap is like, well, what's being heard? Make sure I understand this, because I could repeat something to you and you're like, no, bonehead, that's not at all what I meant. So when you were talking about the skills and tools in the practice of medicine, because it's bridging the gap, like you have to go have these difficult conversations with people. That was one of the first things you said. Hey, I've got to be willing to ask hard questions, have the difficult conversation. And then the third piece that I wrote down is I got to listen to how they respond. Because if somebody is saying something back to you, you're giving, and I've been in sales and marketing for a long time. And so one of the things one of my mentors has always said, he says, hey, look, the good news is when you're asking questions, you're not a doctor. It's not life or death. The irony is now, as you and I are having conversations, some of these questions you're having could be life or death, right? And so as you go out here and we're having these conversations, and it could be, that sort of proverbial life and death of like, well, what could happen in my business life if I don't do this thing? And so those 3 pieces, of having difficult conversations, asking the question, being willing to actually have the difficult conversation, act on it, and then really listen to learn, not listening to respond. That's sort of what I heard you say. And then the second piece, well, you said, hey, and here's the second thing, the 2 things that I picked out, and I love, I actually picked up 3 things. I'm going to lead to a next question here in a second. Well, one of them, you said, hey, you have to be willing to take risk to develop a process. And to do that, you need to know why you're doing it. Like, why am I doing this thing that I'm doing? So often, and I think that's relevant if you're a person right now maybe moving into leadership, if you're a follower, I think that's really, really prevalent right now in business. Like people want to know why. We can't just say, hey, we're going to go do this thing and that's the goal and go get it. People want to understand why. And so I think first and foremost, if we take a step back, we're so often as leaders leading into these people that are in front of us. If you take a step back and maybe lean the other direction for a moment, you first have to know why you're asking them to do that and articulate that. And I think that's a very strong statement. The one other thing I picked up on, and I'd like you to expand on this a little bit, Carla, is you said, hey, one of my mentors, and I always find that fascinating because so many people as I'm interviewing and I sit here and I have these amazing conversations, like I'm so blessed to connect with people like you and be able to hear. I'm like, how did we even end up on this show? And I sit here and I learn so much from the people and my guests that I'm having conversations with. And so often people will bring up, hey, I've got a mentor. Do you have somebody that mentors and coaches you right now? Somebody that you lean on when you have difficult things that arise?
That's a really great question. And I've always been, I'm sort of a collector. And by that, I actually not like of mentors of people, not like that. But I collect ideas. And so, I never have been a person who was like, oh, I had this one mentor and part of that has to do also with my career trajectory.
Sure.
But, like leaders, like ourselves, like we represent this very diverse group of people. And one of the interesting things, sorry, this is where my mind went with this, is
yes,
that
absolutely.
You can learn specific things from specific people. You will probably not learn everything from that person. And I think that's really important because I think I don't know that I knew this was even a possibility, but I was kind of a take the learning where you can find it. And like myself, I'm not a perfect person. Like none of the leaders that I learned really good things for were perfect people. And so that's not on the topic of your question, but I think it's a really important thing. And when I think about mentorship, that's actually the first thing that comes into mind that feels important. And now there are definitely places that I get my mentorship from. Sometimes it's sort of colleagues. I find it in different places. Not so much. I don't think it's been so much in the coaching industry, but certainly from the psychology industry, I've been pretty interested in that. Maybe that's some of my medical background coming out. When I pivoted out of medicine, you sort of lose a tribe in a way. And
sure.
So in some ways, coming back to finding some of those colleagues again has been nice. I come at a different angle. Coaching is different than being a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And then I'm married. Like my husband is one of my best thought partners. He is not a coach, so has a very different angle of approach, and but is one of the smartest people I know. And so I love getting different opinions because, of course, that's how we kind of highlight what are our blind spots.
Sure. Well, and I love the fact that you brought that up, is because, and it's funny you say he is not a coach, not by trade maybe, but he is a coach for you, and certainly a good sounding board from the sounds of it when you're talking about this stuff. When you're looking for opinions and such. Couple of things, because I already moved past this part, but I want to make sure that I put this in, and especially if people are listening. Couple of things. I put this on the screen a few times. If you are somebody looking for leadership and executive coaching, you want to check out Carla's website. It's thaxa.com. That's THAXA.com. Also, if you would like to, and so far this has been just a phenomenal conversation. I know we'll continue to build on that. And so if anyone would like to connect with Dr. Carla Fowler on LinkedIn, you just do linkedin.com/in/Carla, CARLA-Fowler, FOWLER. I got to read it off the screen so I don't trip over my words. But if you search for her, she'll come right up. You could connect with with her in that manner on either of those places. And then certainly I'll share all of the other socials and such in the description of the podcast when we're wrapped up here later on today. So a couple of a few different things. One thing I'm curious of, when you did the pivot, you're saying, okay, I'm going to go from the medical field, medicine, into leadership. Was there a defining point? Was there something that you said, you know what, now is the time? And then once you knew that, was it scary, and how did you overcome it? Or did you just go, hey, this is natural, let's go?
Great question. There was sort of a year period where I was in the process, let's say the contemplation process and the decision-making process of like, this phase needs to stop. Like, this is not the thing. So during the year of my general surgery residency, that was the year of coming to terms with like, oh, I see where this is headed, and this is a very important career path. Like, but this is not where I'm headed, and no amount of like pretending is going to change that, right? So at that point, I actually do okay with sunk costs. Like, the idea of like sunk costs often keep us in something longer than we should be. I actually did okay with that. And I think a piece of it was because I never looked at medicine as this thing. Like, all the training I went through, I didn't look at it as like, oh, I learned this skill set that's only useful for this thing. I didn't know exactly how I was going to repackage it all, but I think I looked at it as like, I've invested 11 years in my capabilities. I'm a much more capable person now than I was, when I started at 24. And so that was sort of the pivot point. It was probably a process. There wasn't an aha moment, but there was.
I like that, a pivot process versus a pivot point.
It was scary, but it was clear. So I probably like March or something, I let my program know that I would be staying through the end of the year, but they should fill my spot to go into the next year, which they did. And so then finished the year, left, took 3 months to catch up on sleep, and was also sort of like mulling over, what do I do with all these things? Like, what do I do with my interests? And the theme I just kept coming back to was performance, that I had been coaching people in different forms long before even the concrete idea of building a coaching methodology and practice came up. But it was very clear to me that it needed to be around performance, and that I am a scientist. I think like a scientist, but I'm an applied scientist, and that I don't think academics really is where I belonged. And so I was like, well, we've got a lot of great ideas out there about performance, but like, how do I package this and really turn it into a usable methodology that where people who are not scientists can access it and really use it in clear ways? So I liked the idea of building something new and getting to stretch my sort of applied scientist muscles to find a solution to a problem in a new way. And it was absolutely terrifying. They do not train you in business in medical school. So you could argue I went into something that like I had like no knowledge of one piece of it. And I had a lot of ideas about the coaching piece of it. But, this is actually, these things are learnable. And I know like you know this with your background, that we often find ourselves at a point when there's a lot of uncertainty, but part of that uncertainty is actually that it represents a gap between what we know now and what we could know or what we need to know. And so, yeah, it was uncomfortable and terrifying. And it probably felt that way for at least like the first 7 to 8 years. And yet
really,
I was growing and building. Yeah. That first.
No, I love the fact that you said the first 7, because here's the thing. I think a lot of people, so often you see that and you think, oh, well, after the first 6 months you've overcome it, or the first year, certainly they're going to overcome that thing. It's different. And I think you'll agree with this. Like, it is different when you're out on your own, when you're an entrepreneur and they've pulled the safety net out. And I think people need to hear that. You're probably one of the first guests that has said that openly, because I think everyone goes, oh yeah, I worked through the fear. I put my head down. I have another good friend of mine. I interviewed her early on some time ago, and I asked her, how did she go through fear? And I loved her answer. She said, well, I literally just put my head down and did it scared. And
Mhm.
she says, that's all you can do sometimes. I love the fact that you sort of, for me, have expanded on that you're like, hey, I was doing it scared and I was learning the thing, and there's this gap in there, but it was for like 7 or 8 years. It's not a week long process. It wasn't even until the end of the year and so forth. Um, so
Well,
I love that you shared that. I really do.
thank you,
Think it's
Mike.
valuable.
I'm very pleased to share it because again, I think another piece about performance that people often like we don't see reflected in the social media commentary about it
Mm-hmm.
is that learning is uncomfortable. Sometimes not as uncomfortable when we're younger, but actually for those of us who are mid-career, maybe even entering that leadership position, even though being a leader might be a very new thing for you, because we are like far enough along, we're already an expert maybe at an individual contributor thing that we know how to do. It makes it extra uncomfortable for us because we sort of have this assumption that we should somehow know how to do it. I mean, I was a doctor, like I was a double doctor, and yet I was a total beginner at business, and it would have been really easy to like beat up on myself about that, and I tried very hard to like not do that part of it. But yeah,
Right.
like you're learning, and so to normalize that I think is pretty important.
Well, and as you've gone through this over a number of years, here's the interesting thing, and I'm curious with you've pointed to psychology quite a few times, and so I'm curious if you have an opinion on this. I don't need a deep like psychological or medical explanation, but I'm curious if you have an opinion, and you may have a deep explanation when I ask this next question. Because one of the things, and you said, hey, we don't experience this as kids quite so much, but then somewhere along the way, and where it went to, where my head went to is because I have a very young granddaughter right now. She's 9 months old. She's just pulling herself up, and she's crawling, and she's doing all these cool things that as a grandfather. God, it's weird for me to call myself a grandfather, but as a granddad, it's like, holy cow, this is wild, right? But as a little baby on into childhood, barring some physical disability, everybody's pulling for that child to say, look, there, you just keep going until she's going to walk now. She's going to go when she's 9 months old. Here we go, rock and roll, right? And we keep pushing and we keep pushing, and we're so that's where their brain is just like a parachute. They're so open to going until, right? We just keep pushing until. And then as kids, you see the same thing. Well, I'm just going to figure out this thing. There's a book, I can't think of who it's by, but what it's called, Everything is Figure Outable, right? And so it's like as children we learn to play sports, and we're like, hey, what are the rules? I don't know, but we'll figure it out and let's go. And then something happens along the way, and I'm curious if you have an opinion on when this happens. Maybe it's teenage years, late teens, early 20s, where we lose that luster of I'm going to go until to, well, I tried that once and it didn't work, I'm not doing that again. Do you have an opinion on that? I'm curious.
You know, I think one of the things that happens is that we start to get the expectation of like we should know before we go. And that actually represents something very good on one hand. It
Okay.
represents the idea that we can prepare, and we now have access to so many resources, so this can kind of compound it. It's like, well, of course I should look up X, Y, and Z about how to do everything. But like we were saying earlier, it creates this idea of like we should show up ready to go, like on the first, at the first moment. Like if you put me whatever, like in a batting cage, I should just know how to hit the ball. I've watched enough YouTube videos.
Right.
Although, by the way, I met this amazing skier. This this is a total aside, but
I love this.
um,
It's how my brain works. I'm brand
I
new.
love backcountry skiing. Every sort of holiday season, my husband and I go and do kind of an extensive like sort of backcountry ski, and deep powder, lots of trees, super fun. I met another guest who was at the lodge, and he had taught himself to ski. He was this was difficulty high difficulty skiing. He had taught himself how to ski primarily from YouTube videos. And he was incredible. Now, to be fair, it wasn't just he sat and watched YouTube videos and then like showed up on the first day and could ski. And so this is a wonderful example to illustrate the point of saying what we can't do is fall into this idea of like, if I just know everything before I go, then when I go, I'll just be able to do it. But he had gone back and forth, obviously had practiced, watched another video, practiced some more. And so I think what we need to do is not let those things stop us from getting into action, and also not let those things kind of judge us to say we're going to be a beginner at something if we start something new. And not only that, but that just like you were so beautifully describing with your granddaughter, that to sort of grow and learn is human innately. And somehow there are, yes, social anxieties or expectations or culture that can start to like add layers on that create some friction. But that I think actually when we're at our least happy is when we're stagnant. And so being able to peel back some of those layers and re-find that it's okay to not be good at something and to need to learn and work at it, particularly like at mid-career, super important.
Well, and some of the things you're bringing up, I'm going to hang on this too, because I think you pointed this out beautifully, is the fact you said, hey, you met this guy at the ski lodge. There's more to it than just there is no osmosis, right? Oh, well, I watched this thing, and so now I'm an expert at it. It actually takes doing the thing. It actually takes action. And, so like when we're children, we just try things. We just, it's the kindergarten principle. We just try stuff. And the reality is when we try stuff, most of the time, I mean, use my granddaughter analogy, not to just get tied up on that, but like we're all cheering her on. When you get into kindergarten and somebody just tries something, everybody's cheering you on. At some point, we have this false belief, I guess, that people aren't going to continue cheering you on. And there are some people that don't, but then my stance on that, and that's a whole different show, is those kick those non-cheerleaders out of your life, right? If they're not going to help you cheer you on to do whatever the action is that you're going after. One thing that I'm curious of, because you coach at a very high level and you coach executives and obviously do a fantastic job at it. And I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. I'm curious, what do you see? Because you get all of these different little bright points. And I think so often if somebody's tuning into the show to listen, they're looking for like, hey, and you said earlier, like, hey, there's no tips, there's no tricks, there's no hacks. There's not, but there are, I want to choose my words carefully. I think we can have some shortcuts through somebody else's experience, but we still are required to experience it. So
very well said. I often say there are good principles, and then you can like start to work through those. Yeah. So
and that's a perfect segue. I have two questions for you. One is I'm curious, what do you see in mass when you're looking at coaching clients, and what's this common thread that runs through? What is the one or two biggest mistakes that you see people make when they're trying to improve their performance, when they're trying to move to the next level, when they're trying to grow themselves in a thing or many things? What are some mistakes that you see that you go, look, that is a universal truth. This happens.
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say we talked about one of them, like I need to know before I go. So we already kind of covered that.
Okay.
I think another important one is that so we've talked a lot about action. Action is important, but you also mentioned earlier that leaders need to be able to take a moment to like step back. And one of the ways I think about this is as leaders, one of the most important jobs that we have to do is think about how we want to allocate resources. This can be money, this can be time, this can be team attention. But we have to think about where are we going to put that where it will have the most potent benefit towards the things we want to accomplish? And there's a lot wrapped up in what I just said. So a couple things to break it down. Number one, I think one of the most important jobs that a leader does is to create focus and clarity for the team. So the team knows, like, where should we spend energy? How is our contribution making an impact or mattering? And what are we aiming at? Like, how do we all win together? And one of the things that it feels like a luxury to leaders, and so I think often there isn't time to do it, but also they don't prioritize it, is giving themselves time to think. Because ultimately, to help your team have clarity, you have to have mental clarity first. And I often call this brutal focus. It's like, start to practice brutal focus. And I often associate 3 questions with that. So I often encourage leaders to create some time for themselves to step back and think about, number one, what is actually most important to accomplish? And this has to do with the goals or the objectives, knowing that if you go after too many things, you're often not successful because you've diluted your attention. The second question is, what are actually the most important, like, impact points or priorities that we have to go after that thing? Like, if I'm going to have my team work on things or focus on things, like, where should they be spending their time? And then the third question is, what is really extraneous and or distracting that is going to pull us off course? And I think these are questions that you can use as a practice. You can come back to them again and again because priorities do shift. The landscape shifts, the goals can change, but it's important to be clear as a leader. And then the second piece, once you've got your own mental clarity, is to find moments and ways to keep communicating with your team about that. Because ironically, it not only gives your team clarity to make them effective, but it also is very motivating for teams when they're like, I know what we're doing. We are aligned. We're all working towards the same thing. And we know how to score in this game. And we know that, like, I know that my contribution matters and this other person's contribution matters. And we know how we fit in. So I think that's one of the things that is like the first thing to go when things get busy. But I would actually argue is one of the most important things a leader can create some time for.
That is absolutely wonderful. And so I'm just going to step back for 1 second. And I know, with respect for your time, we'll wrap up here. We're just about at the 45-minute mark. And so I'm pushing time. I've got several more questions I want to ask. I'm going to have you back on the show. I'm going to have you back
Mike,
again.
It would be a pleasure. We've probably scratched, I know we haven't dug all the way in.
No,
but yeah,
but
we'll
I love it
right
because the question was sort of, hey, what are some of the biggest mistakes people make? And you said, hey, the one is being fearful of the no before I got to know before I go. The second thing you said was leaders got to take a step back because we're leaning in all the time. And then within those, creating focus and clarity, man, I think you are so spot on that it's like, if people are clear, they can just cut through stuff like a knife through butter, right? If I know where I'm headed, I have clarity of direction, I know my leader is going to have my back because they've been clear on this. I think that makes so much sense. And it's simple. But to do that, I liked your wording, brutal focus. You got to give yourself time to think. And I think you're right on that. Enough leaders don't do that because we're in the thick of it all the time, right? We're going and going and going. So as we wrap up here, so any final thoughts you'd like to share to take us out today? And I would love to have you back because I got 2 or 3 more questions written down. We'll jump in and rapid fire another time. But any final thoughts, Carla, to take us out today?
Oh man, so many thoughts. But one of the things, this might have come from a question that you sent me ahead of time. I don't know, but I just loved it. And I think it was about, what are some impacts like leaders have had on me, or what were some of the most impactful things? And so I like to reflect on this because it's probably different for other people. I found that a lot of the leaders that I got to participate with or was mentored by, one of the most impactful things for me was they created space for me to grow. And I'll be honest, it wasn't always comfortable and it wasn't always fun. And I think that's important to say out loud because sometimes we think like we want all the things and we don't always get all the things. But I look back and I think that like everything that I have in terms of a capability or the things I've even been able to build on my own now have their roots in leaders who created space and challenge and left the challenge in front of me. They didn't take it away. You know, they didn't, I'm not saying they weren't helpful, but it wasn't like, here, let me help you with that. Like that. And I think this sometimes, this is hard to do as a leader. I mean, we're all human. We want to be liked. We want to be supportive. And I'm not arguing against support, but we have to remember that also part of the best gift we can give people is to let them face some challenges, go figure some things out, and because they will take away so much from that.
No, that's really, really good point. So thank you, Dr. Carla Fowler, for spending time with me today on the Leadership Toolkit. I appreciate you. If you would just hang out for 1 second and I'll go ahead and take us out, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, that is going to bring us to the close of another episode of the Leadership Toolkit. Man, I've got 2 pages of notes, as I always do. I mean so genuinely, I love the opportunity to learn from my guests. Do me a favor, if you would, everybody, a couple things. You can check out Thaxa.com, Thaxa.com. You can look for Carla Fowler on LinkedIn if you'd like to connect with her more one-on-one. I'll have the other connection points and social media and such in the show notes. And last but not least, certainly, please do me a favor, throw some thumbs up on this episode of the show, whatever place you may be watching it on, or maybe if you're listening on Spotify or Apple or YouTube afterwards, make sure and throw those thumbs up. And most importantly, share it with a friend where you feel this would make an impact, because that's what we're looking to do, is just help other people grow, affect them, infect them, pour into them, and help others grow. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We'll talk to you soon. Stay great.